Hi, so as Ed said, the reading is from 1 Kings chapter 10, and that's on page 348 of the Church Bibles. 1 Kings chapter 10. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be, how happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices, precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Hiram's ships brought gold from Ophir, and from there they brought great cargoes of almug wood and precious stones. The king used the almug wood to make supports for the temple of the Lord and for the royal palace, and to make harps and lyres for the musicians. So much almug wood has never been imported or seen since that day. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he'd given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold, with 3 minas of gold in each shield. The king put them in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. Then the king made a great throne covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned, carrying gold, silver, and ivory, and apes and baboons. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift: articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kew. The royal merchants purchased them from Kew at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans.
Thanks, Helen. Do keep that open. If you were with us last week, you'll know that when it comes to sort of interpreting, understanding these chapters at this stage of King Solomon's life story, chapters 9 and 10, we basically have a choice to make to sort of understand them and interpret them. So we have a choice between whether we think chapters 9 and 10 describe a golden age or a gilded age. A golden age, if we go back, is a period of peace, harmony, stability, and prosperity. And certainly a lot of what we've just heard would seem to sort of tick that box nicely, wouldn't it? But there's also the possibility that what we're reading here might describe a gilded age, a period of gross materialism and blatant political corruption. We saw that there were elements of both of those sorts of age in chapter 10 and chapter 9, and we're going to see the same here in chapter 10. And I'm sort of slightly tempted to get everybody to sort of vote as to which sort of way you're leaning. Are you a sort of a golden age person or a gilded age person? It might depend on your personality, as we established last week. But it might also depend on what biblical lenses you're reading these chapters through. It might depend on, as it were, what other part of the Old Testament you're using to interpret these chapters. Let me demonstrate that for you. So it's just worth noting that there are a number of people that interpret 1 Kings chapter 10, this visit of the Queen of Sheba, through a particular Old Testament lens. They read 1 Kings chapter 10 alongside another key Old Testament passage, which is Genesis chapter 12. And if you do that, well, you will tend to see this chapter as part of the Golden Age. Why is that? Well, listen to some verses from Genesis chapter 12. Listen to God make some massive promises to the sort of the patriarch of the Israelite nation, known at that time as Abraham. This is what God says to him. This is what God, as it were, promises him at the beginning of Israel's national life. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." It's those last words that particularly excite some people when it comes to this visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon. Because Sheba was miles away from Jerusalem. Sheba was potentially where Yemen is today, although there's an argument from some that it's where Ethiopia is today. We're not going to get into that, but it was a very long way away. It was the edge of the known world. And so this incident, when people from the very edge of the world are coming to Jerusalem, are coming to Israel's king, and are asking Israel's king for wisdom, is seen by some people as a really exciting fulfillment of this promise that all peoples on earth will be blessed through one of Abraham's descendants, through, in 1 Kings chapter 10, King Solomon. This would seem to be just a wonderful time when God's prophecies in the past are coming true. A golden age when people from all over the world are flocking to Jerusalem and meeting the God of Israel. When what God's people are doing, what God's king is doing, is attracting people to the God of Israel. That is the case for a golden age. People who read 1 Kings chapter 10 through the lens of Genesis 12. I mean, just the fact that gold comes up so many times is really exciting them, because it just seems to be clearly a golden age. 11 times gold is mentioned in chapter 10. How much more golden can you get than that? But, say some other people, the fact that gold is mentioned 11 times in chapter 10 is itself really suspicious, particularly if you are reading 1 Kings chapter 10, not in the light of Genesis 12, but in the light of another key Old Testament passage. Some verses from Deuteronomy chapter 17. Some words that God spoke to Moses, another leader of God's people, about what it would be like for his people Israel to have a king. And in this passage, God himself gave his people some particular warnings about what it would be like to have a king. And he provided them with some alarm bell moments to know that things were going wrong if their future king behaved in certain ways. Listen in to what God says through his spokesman, Moses. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled into it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Do you see that if you read 1 Kings chapter 10 in the light of that passage, you start to get worried, don't you? Some alarm bells begin to go off. You begin to think that actually Solomon's reign might not be a golden age, but actually a gilded age, that the things that are sort of highlighted as being sort of part of Solomon's reign and magnificence here in 1 Kings chapter 10 are actually not very good things when it comes to God's point of view. So when you read 1 Kings 10, verses 26 to 28, alongside Deuteronomy 17 and verse 16, alarm bells go off, don't they? You're basically told, do not have horses from Egypt. Don't do that. That's wrong. That's an alarm bell moment. And what are we told in 1 Kings? That he has loads of horses from Egypt. The very thing God says the king shouldn't do is the very thing that King Solomon is doing. And the 11 mentions of gold here in 1 Kings chapter 10 don't sound so good in the light of Deuteronomy 17 and verse 17, where we read of the king, he must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. More of that in chapter 11 and how that goes wrong. But also, he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. One of the rules the king was not to break was amassing money, gold for himself. What do we read again and again in 1 Kings chapter 10? That this king, King Solomon, was amassing gold and silver for himself. Do you see how you interpret 1 Kings chapter 10 depends on which Old Testament lenses you're reading it through. Genesis chapter 12, it's a golden age. Deuteronomy 17, it's a gilded age. Which do you think it is? What do you think? What I'd love to use, apparently you can use Slido to do a vote. And one day we actually might, really embrace democracy and do a vote halfway through a sermon. But for now, we're not going to do that. I'm just going to sort of come up with a novel idea, and that is that we don't actually have to choose. We don't have to choose between a golden age and a gilded age. That actually, I think the point of 1 Kings chapter 10 and chapter 9 in its place was to make the point that yes, Solomon, as at one level golden, it was a high point. It was a triumphant point in Israel history. And yet at the very same time, it was skin deep. It was a gilded age. Lots was going wrong. Things weren't quite what they should have been. I think the point of chapter 10 is this. A human king can fulfill God's promises, but only in a very limited and a severely compromised way. Any human being's greatness and success will be passing and will be undermined by their failures, by their sin. King Solomon would be exhibit A to make that point. But of course, we don't just need to look at Solomon to make that point. We could basically, couldn't we, pick on any human leader to make that point. Any human leader there has been, even the greats, even those who have been seen to and to some extent have brought in a golden age, it has always been gilded to some extent. There's always been some extent to which it's been skin deep. It hasn't lasted and it has always gone wrong. And when they have gone, cracks have appeared. And people have begun to see that this ruler who seemed so great wasn't quite so great after all. Just think of one of the last century's most admired political leaders, JFK, 35th President of the United States. After his assassination in 1963, his administration was portrayed as a modern-day Camelot, an idyllic reign of a near-perfect ruler, served by a whole new young generation of idealists. People look back on it through rose-tinted spectacles. But it soon emerged that the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis was a womanizer who relied on some of those idealistic young aides to enable his infidelities. People started to look back at his time not as a golden age, but as a gilded age. Earlier this summer, I read, and no doubt you read too, this biography, memoir of one of JFK's closest political aides. I know that it was what most people were reading on the beach this summer. Ted Sorensen was an idealistic young political aide to JFK, and he writes this book, Counselor, about his time serving JFK, and he builds JFK up as a man at the heart of a golden age. But there's one very painful chapter in which he has to reflect on what has emerged about his hero's weaknesses, how his hero abused, used women. And you read this chapter and you feel Ted Sorensen's pain as he wants to say JFK was perfect, and yet has so much evidence stacked up against him that he was not perfect and that he damaged people deeply. Ted Sorensen really struggles to make sense of the golden and the gilded, the strengths and the weaknesses, the good things and the sin. And I think that's common to all of us, isn't it? We like leaders to be perfect. We like to look back on people as part of some golden age. We don't like imperfection. We don't like gilded ages. And that seems to be the struggle that a number of Bible commentators have when it comes to King Solomon, as well as Ted Sorensen's struggle when it comes to JFK. But the Bible doesn't let us see King Solomon, or indeed any human leader, bar one, as perfect. And we need to interpret what we read in 1 Kings chapter 10 in the light of Genesis 12, but also in the light of Deuteronomy 17. We need to interpret these verses also in the light of what the Bible tells us about what it is to be human. The very first 3 chapters of the Bible really help us, don't we, make sense of how amazing people can be at the same time as so flawed. How good people can be at the same time as so bad. How successful people can be at the same time as such failures. How encouraging and positive people can be at the same time as full of so much sin and capable of so much abuse. And so perhaps the chapters that we need to read 1 Kings 10 in the light of most of all are Genesis 1 to 3. What they teach us that we are creatures created in the image of God. We're glorious. Genesis chapters 1 and 2. But we are creatures whose minds, bodies, hearts have been ruined by our rejection of the Creator. Chapter 3. It's that lens on humanity, isn't it, that most helps us make sense of Solomon with all his strengths and all his weaknesses, of JFK, all the good things, all the bad things? Of you? Or your strengths? Or your weaknesses? Of me, the good parts? The bad parts? It's a biblical worldview that helps us make sense of what's going on in 1 Kings, what's going on in political history, what's going on in here. And it's also that sort of that experience of perfection in the beginning that Genesis 1 and 2 talk about, that also help us make sense of that desire for a perfect leader that we all have. You ever wondered why we as humanity just have this obsession with perfection? Why we have this idea that one day a perfect leader will appear? I mean, you could say, couldn't you, it is just stupid. I mean, why do we keep on thinking a perfect leader is going to appear when every single leader that has appeared has not been perfect? But we have this desire for perfection because we were created perfect. We have this desire for a perfect leader because we were meant to live in a perfect world, under a perfect king. But it isn't King Solomon. It isn't JFK. It isn't you. Don't know if that's news for you. It isn't me, sadly. It's Jesus. We have this desire for perfection. We have this desire for a perfect ruler. We're constantly disappointed. We're constantly let down again and again in the pages of Scripture. Somebody seems to be ticking all the boxes, but it all goes wrong until you come to King Jesus, who ticks every single box and proves himself not to be the glorious ruin that you and I are, but a glorious ruler. When Jesus walked this earth, one of the things he said to crowds was that something greater than Solomon is here. Matthew chapter 12, verse 42, that's how he described himself, as something greater than Solomon. And of course, it is Jesus that is the true fulfillment of Genesis chapter 12. He's the one through whom God is going to bless the whole world. And of course, it's Jesus that, when you look at Deuteronomy chapter 17 and you look at what can go wrong and what can go right, it's Jesus is the king that gets it all right. Jesus is the real thing. Solomon, just a shadow, just a foretaste. At the best, Solomon is a great little picture of how much greater King Jesus is. At his worst, when you despair at King Solomon, you just wonderfully pointed to how King Jesus won't disappoint us like him. So we need to see 1 Kings chapter 10 as just a bit of realism. A human being, a human king, like Solomon, can only get you so far. Can only fulfill God's promises so far. What we really need is a better, a perfect king in Jesus. And as we think like that, I suppose it's worth asking, well then, what is the point of this chapter? I mean, last week's chapter told us that Solomon was okay, but Jesus is even better. And let's be honest, most chapters in 1 Kings have told us that Solomon's okay, that Jesus is even better. And so we might begin to think, what is the point of all these chapters if the basic point is the same? King Solomon, okay, Jesus, even better. I mean, what is the point, you might be asking? You know, it's great, isn't it, to read that the Queen of Sheba went on to TripAdvisor one day and read some really good reviews about King Solomon. I mean, look down at verses 6, 7, and 8. She read some great stuff about King Solomon. And as a result of that TripAdvisor review, she went a long way to see King Solomon. And she confirmed on TripAdvisor that what she'd read was correct. But actually, the reality was even better. But what's the point of this trip? What's the point of her comments? What's the point of all these riches she, as it were, loads onto King Solomon? Down there in verse 10. Huge amounts of all the things that sort of were valuable in that world, down to apes and baboons delivered by her to King Solomon. What's the point of that? If it's just to make this point that King Solomon, okay, Jesus, better. Well, I think there's one final lens we should use to understand 1 Kings verse 10 that will help us to see the full significance of what's going on when this Queen of Sheba visits the Jerusalem of King Solomon's time. And we're going to head now right to the very end of our Bibles and to Revelation chapter 21. And not the verses at the beginning, which we often turn to, but these verses 22 to 27. God's apostle John writes this about the New Jerusalem. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb its lamp. The nation will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. What was happening in 1 Kings chapter 10 was just a little trailer, just a little indication, just a little sort of advert in ancient history of what's going to happen in the future. One day soon, King Jesus is going to come back to reign. He's going to reign in a new Jerusalem, a Jerusalem that no longer needs a temple because God himself will be living with his people. And on that day, one of the things that's going to happen is that treasure from all nations is going to be brought into Jesus' kingdom. All the great things that humanity have created over the years, all the different things from different parts of the world are going to be brought in to King Jesus' treasury. Queen of Sheba brought a little bit of stuff from one place at one particular time. But on that day, the riches of this planet, the glories of this planet, the glories in art and music and literature and engineering and architecture and the rest are going to be brought in to King Jesus' kingdom. And then, and on that day, the words that the Queen of Sheba says will be the sort of words that we say, the sort of words we address to King Jesus. Look down again at 1 Kings and verses 6 through to 9. This is the sort of thing we will be saying to King Jesus on that day when we see him in all his glory and we see the glory of this world brought into his eternal kingdom. We'll say to him, the reports we heard in our own countries about your achievements and your wisdom are true. But we did not believe these things until we came and saw you with our own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told us. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the reports we heard. How happy we now are. How happy are all those who serve you, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to you and to your Father God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel, on the throne of the new heavens and the new earth. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, for God's people in all times and all places, he has made you, King Jesus, to maintain justice and righteousness forever. Perhaps when you first read these words of the Queen of Sheba coming in to King Solomon's temple, and you thought, perhaps in your mind's eyes, how wonderful that day was, how amazing it must have been there to see all that gold and that silver and that architecture and those creatures and to be caught up in that moment. Yeah, it was a pretty good day, but nothing compared to the day that Revelation 21 describes, when the treasures of the whole world are brought in front of King Jesus, and where the words of the Queen of Sheba will be our words to the King of Kings, to the Lord of Lords, to Jesus Christ himself. Let's pray. King Jesus, we thank you that one day we will be part of that gathering around your throne of people of all tribes and nations, that great promise to Genesis 12 will have been fulfilled. you blessing the whole world. And we thank you that you will be the perfect king, a king who will not disappoint us, a king who will not let us down, a king that will reign forever. We look forward to the day when the riches of this current world are brought to you in the new world, and when you will reign on the highest throne forever. Father, when we're disappointed with biblical leaders, when we're disappointed with political leaders, when we're disappointed with church leaders, help us remember that the only leader, the only king who will never disappoint us is you. And may that fuel our praise of you and our excitement about your coming kingdom. May it come soon. For we pray this in your name. Amen. I'm going to sing now, and we're going to sing. Great. So over now to Helen, who has got our questions.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of clarification questions and then a couple of application questions. So, first question, isn't chapter 10 also showing God fulfilling the promises he made to Solomon back in 3 verse 13? So, as a little reminder to people, that's where Solomon asked for wisdom, and because God was happy with that answer, he said, I'll also give you lots of wealth, lots of riches. So if it is God fulfilling those promises, can Solomon be charged with a gilded age? Would it not be a golden age?
Yeah, thank you. And again, the answer is a bit yes and no, because yes, it is partly in fulfillment of those promises, but this is there's a stage, and we had this earlier on, where Solomon uses the gold to build a temple. If you'll notice in this chapter, he's using the gold just to sort of please himself and build a greater throne and get these horses from Egypt. So yes and no is constantly the sort of pattern. It's gold or gilded. And I found myself constantly being swayed by one sort of thing that makes me think golden, then gilded. That sort of past prophecy makes you think, oh, perhaps it was golden. And then you think, actually, you look at the details and you think, perhaps gilded.
And this is maybe another verse that might link into kind of people's interpretations. Verse 14 says that the yearly weight of gold that Solomon had was 666 talents. Somebody says, is there any symbolic meaning to the 666? That's a number that we tend to think of as being satanic.
Can I say thank you so much for asking this question? Because I thought to myself before I left my study this morning, what is the question somebody asked that I don't want to be answered? And I thought it's about the 666, and I looked it up just so that I would have something to say thank you. When it comes to interpreting biblical numbers, obviously 666 is a significant one that has got loads of freight since, and in films and elsewhere. I think the best way of understanding 666 is just thinking the perfect number, or the perfect numbers, from a biblical point of view, are 3 and 7. So 7 is the number of completion. Okay? 666 is basically, it is a not yet complete number 3 times, which is probably sort of, as it were, basically saying this idea of things not being quite what it would fit with the sort of golden but gilded sort of thing. It's not basic. It's basically not perfect. It's not perfect, and it's not perfect 3 times, which would just sort of suggest that Solomon's sort of era is a high point, but it's not the real high point. Because from a biblical point of view, things are complete when things are 7, and when things are said 3 times, you'll know that in the Old Testament, holy, holy, holy is, 3 times you say something to stress how holy God is. This is 3 times stressing that this is an imperfect, not quite there number. Thank you for allowing me to be pleased with myself.
Did you just put that question in yourself?
No, I didn't.
Okay, a couple of questions that are kind of related. So, given the context you have in your sermon, is it realistic, as we do, to consistently expect perfection from people, place, or things? If you're going to say no, what should we expect? And then I've got another one for you.
Yeah, and we do, don't we, constantly expect perfection from other people, sometimes for ourselves, in ways that actually often just damages other people and damages ourselves. And we just got to recognize it is not going to happen here on earth. And getting cross with somebody else because they're not perfect is a very stupid thing to do. To get cross with yourself because you're not perfect is a very stupid thing to do, because the only perfect being that has existed on this planet as a human being is Jesus. So it's just a sort of, don't crush other people or crush yourself under an expectation of perfection, because that can damage you. It can damage other people. The only perfect person is Jesus. That doesn't mean that you think, because nobody can be perfect, there are no standards, and I shouldn't expect other people to be like Jesus as much as they can. I shouldn't expect myself to become more like Jesus as much. We should expect that, but we shouldn't expect perfection, because that only comes in Jesus.
Okay, and final question then. How can we remain prayerful for fallible leaders rather than defeatist?
Yeah, I think, how can we remain prayerful? Well, I think perhaps the best way would be just to sort of, let's say you're praying for me, because I'd fit, that category nicely. We should be praying for them. You should be praying that, you basically should be praying for any human leader, particularly Christian leaders. You should be praying that Jesus will help them. They're not perfect. There is someone who's perfect, and it's Jesus. And you should be praying that they will become more like Jesus. They'd be remembering, they'll be sort of receiving, experiencing Jesus' love more, and they'll be living out their experience of Jesus' love in the way that they love other people. So you just be, when you see sort of an imperfect leader, you should be praying that the perfect Jesus comes alongside them and helps them to become more and more like Jesus. Great, thank you. Should we